The new American slavery. I am not here to be overly critical of Michelle Alexander. I think her book does wonderful things. But I approach the issue of incarceration from a different perspective. So I'm going to share that with you, and then at the end, I want to talk about what I think the prison industrial complex has been a part of growing, well, a cancer in this country, what I would call, what Cornell West would call, the nihilistic threat. So we'll end with that. Okay, just to get us started, real quick. The United States is the largest jailer on the planet. We incarcerate, some people might think, well, China, right? They're undemocratic, so wouldn't they incarcerate more people? Well, no. As you can see from the chart, 748 per 100,000 citizens is how many people the United States incarcerates. There's only one government that has incarcerated more of its own people than the United States does right now. Want to take a guess?
Nazi Germany.
Huh?
No.
North Korea? No.
Nazi Germany.
Nazi Germany, well, yes, but it's a different situation under wartime in the final solution. So yeah, you could say yes to that. I could say yes to that, but I'm thinking, let's say post-World War II. But yeah, I would agree with that. The Gulag under Stalin. It's the only government who's incarcerated more people than the United States. The United States has more African Americans in prison today than there were at the height of apartheid in South Africa, where blacks made up 90% of the population. Okay? No one incarcerates more than we do. That's what we need to talk about today. Oh, okay, I'm missing a slide. That's all right. These are 03 numbers, but they've remained, the bottom number has actually changed. African Americans make up roughly about 13% of the population now. And no longer is it 43%, it's now 53% of the prison population. So if you make up 13% of the general population, over half of the prison population, something's going on, right? Something's going on. And we need to try and understand what it is. Here's imprisonment by race, okay? So as you look over the numbers, here you have, this is per 100,000, right, which is the scale we're measuring by. Then over the years, right, and this bar here is African American males. Okay? So this is nothing short of a crisis in America. Not just the African American community. I'll get to that in a minute. But certainly in the African American community, incarceration is a significant part of the life experience of most people. How many people in here know someone who is currently in prison, on probation, or on parole? Raise your hand. It's a whole lot of people, okay? Now, we're talking about, in the United States, 2.3 million who are incarcerated right now. If you add probation and parole, you're talking about 7 million people, the majority of whom are African American. So we're going to examine this briefly now from what I would call a systems approach, right? Systems analysis. And the system that I want to look at here briefly is the system of colonialism. And I would say internal colonialism, okay? Now, we use this approach for a couple of reasons. Come on, baby. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so I was playing with, my first time with the animation thing and all that, So anyway, the systems approach allows us to look at a system of oppression rather than individuals, right? So we're looking at the rule, not the exception to the rule, okay? So rather than us saying, well, but, there are African Americans who commit crimes, yes, we know that. But we have to ask the question, what are the systems that are in place that create the environment in which we police the way we police? That's what I'm saying? Okay, so that's what we're doing, right? It stresses the relationship, a colonial relationship, I would argue, between a metropolitan center, in Galtung type language, center, and a periphery that is the exploited group. And if we look at things that way, then we are able to use colonial, neo-colonial, and post-colonial methodologies to explain the system. So we're looking at a structure. We're not talking about today, because I don't have time, free will individual accountability. We're not talking about that right now. That is part of the equation. But we need to really understand the system by which the prison industrial complex has been created. Okay? And it relies on a system that was put in play in the early part of the 20th century, and we're going to use as an example the ghetto in Chicago. Now, you could use Milwaukee, you could use New York, you could use LA, you could use any city, you could use Elgin, okay? But that's what we're going to look at is Chicago, because here's my question. Do you think that the ghetto was organic to the development of Chicago, or is it a constructed thing?
Constructed.
It's constructed. If it's constructed, you don't construct things without a purpose for their construction. I mean, we're just being logical. So the question is, what does that mean? How do we play that out? Okay, so we know about colonialism in general, right? An alien group, remember, right, the English and the 13 colonies, right? So an alien group exploits or subjugates a indigenous or transplanted group within the borders of a single country. The best example we can think of, I can think of, is right, Native Americans. Where did the United States government put Native Americans in general? Reservations. So here's the alien group that comes in, and the indigenous group is forced off of their land into a certain designated area that we call a reservation. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. That's an example. Apartheid in South Africa, where the white minority had complete political and economic control over the indigenous black majority. Right? That's the apartheid system. Okay? And so So all colonial systems have at least a dynamic of an internal way of developing, because you have to run the colony and so forth. If you're talking about a metropole like England and the 13 colonies, right? Who supplied England with certain materials and so on, and then they were a market for cheap goods from England to the colonies, right? That's a colonial relationship. There's also an internal relationship that can be done between that alien group and an indigenous or transplanted group. Is everybody okay? I won't get into the Vietnam example, but I'm teaching that right now, so if I get into that one, we're never coming back. Okay. But just looking at geography doesn't quite get us there when we're talking about applying it to a system like the ghetto. So the key to understanding this is not necessarily geography, it's about the distribution of power. It's about the relationship socioeconomically between the subjugated, transplanted, or indigenous group and the alien majority group that is wielding power over them. That's the relationship. That's what we need to look at. Okay? All right. So why do you have colonialism? Basic stuff, right? Economic exploitation, political domination to serve as a captive market, to get resources, cheap labor, its institutional roots. I want to just stay for a minute, you can look at all this, is the urgencies of colonialism is built on a process of mystifying the oppressed to justify the wrong. Did you catch that?
Yeah.
Okay, so if all right, we just got to go there. They just won't invite me back. It's okay. Why do you think it was illegal to teach slaves to read? That's my question. Knowledge is power. Right? So if you bring them the Bible and say, slaves obey your masters, blah, 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 and feed them that gospel, you can use that tool to mystify, right? As a way of coercion. And at the same time, use it to justify slavery, right? Okay, so you turn on the 6 o'clock news, and every story where there's somebody getting shot or robbed or whatever, what is the face that we see? Black faces. Come on, we're just talking. So that gets used culturally to mystify the oppressed, to say, see, this is who you are. And then it justifies the treatment of that group. See, they're all criminals. Right? Because when I walk down the street, I see women, clutching their purse. And quick story. Okay, quick story. So, lady gets on an elevator. She was in Las Vegas. She just won at the slot machines. So she gets on the elevator, she's got her little bucket full of quarters. I mean, she's just like, whoo, So when she walks on the elevator, there are these two very muscular, dark, black men. And she, she's trying to move in over here. And so the one says to the other one, hit the floor, man. Boom! She's on the ground, quarters everywhere, don't grab me! And meanwhile, the guy, he hits the button to go to the floor that they were on. So the next day, she wakes up and the hotel is bringing her all these beautiful flowers. And the card says, "Thanks for the laughs, Eddie Murphy and Michael Jordan." Right? Because they weren't Eddie Murphy and Michael Jordan on that elevator to that woman. Right? Okay, that's my point. And then there are mechanisms of subordination. Racism is a mechanism of subordination. Violence is a mechanism of subordination. Poverty, disfranchisement, debt peonage. Okay, if you pay the MasterCard with the Visa, you are a debt peon. There you go. Okay? All right, debt peonage. Systematic cultural oppression. These are all methodologies, mechanisms that keep the alien group that is socially, economically powerful, continues to allow them to have power or subjugate the alien or the indigenous or transplanted group that is under their influence. Dual labor markets, dual housing markets, okay? So what do we want to see? So the same tools that we can use to analyze colonialism in French Indochina, or Angola, or Algeria, or Brazil, or any other place, we can use those tools to examine the structure of the dynamic of colonialism, of internal colonialism in the formation of the ghetto and a new form, I would argue, of cultural repression, which is the prison industrial complex. Now, Chicago, I don't know if you can see this in the back, but we'll do the best we can. There were two what are called great migrations to Chicago. The first really beginning around 1910 and going into the 1920s. The second from 1940 to 1960. Now, in any migration study, one of the ways of analysis you're going to look at is what are called pull factors and push factors, right? Something's pushing people out of one area and something's pulling them to the new area. Well, blacks are trying to get away from lynching, Jim Crow, all kinds of racial violence going on in the South. And in the North, as industrial jobs are growing, there are those who are sending labor recruiters into the South to recruit blacks to come north. Most of us, if you trace back our families, my family comes from Canton, Mississippi. And then one of the Collins family, and then one of the younger brothers, I don't have time to tell you the story, but left Canton and went to St. Louis and started a family there, working a factory job. And then they went from St. Louis to Davenport, Iowa, working for John Deere, right? Then from Davenport, Iowa, we skipped Chicago to Detroit. And then from Detroit to Buffalo, right? And that's a common thing that we see in a lot of African American families, right? Is this migration chain from wherever the family began, either in or immediately after slavery, through the north. So Chicago was one of the large cities drawing these folks in. Even though there wasn't stated segregation, do you think that those who came from the South to live in Chicago had the freedom to live anywhere they wanted? No. Okay? They were managed into a certain areas, and by 1934, you see this dark area here? This is the African American population, right? There's Martin Luther King Drive, right? Bronzeville, there's 22nd Street, okay? And then you've got it growing a little bit on the west side, a little bit in some of the other factory areas. Now what's interesting about this map is that Denton and Massey, in their great book that you should read, American Apartheid, point out that inside the ghetto there was a really important mechanism going on called the dual housing market, right? So if everybody who's black can only live in a certain area, if I own the housing stock, what can I do to the price? Come on, economists.
Increase
I
it.
can raise the price, right? Lots of demand, not a lot of supply, I can raise the price. So for the same housing, I can charge more money. So now you're just packing more people into a space because it costs more money to rent that space. Are you with me? Now, what about the dual labor market? In 1920, were African Americans allowed into the American Federation of Labor?
No.
No. So as strike breakers, or replacement workers, or other forms of low-wage manufacturing, and then service workers, maids, boot blacks, so on and so forth, they were not able to create a kind of large middle class. Okay, the dual housing market kept people pinned in. The dual labor market guaranteed that wages were low. Right, the same argument, in a way, we use this. The same logic applies to undocumented immigrants today, right? Who are working in agricultural sectors or so on, paid less than minimum wage, no benefits, right? Because it's a boon to the employer. So this is what's going on. And so there's a nice, for those who control the area, exploitation of housing stock, exploitation of labor, so on. In the manufacturing area, they can, people are working for less money. Now, the problem with more and more people coming into the area is eventually it's got to grow, right? And this creates a problem. As the ghetto expands, right, it's almost like block by block warfare, right? Because those who were in one area who were largely whites didn't want blacks moving into their area. So 1919, Eugene Williams goes swimming in Lake Michigan. He crosses over the mythical boundary line of 35th Street, where the Irish Colts, common street gang at the time, had an area that they claimed as their own. They stoned the young man and killed him in Lake Michigan, which precipitated the Chicago race riot of 1919. Now, it wasn't the only one. Springfield, 1908, New York, 1914. I mean, these things were common. Because there was, from a cultural perspective, a desire on the part of whites to keep African Americans from expanding where they were living. Now, inside the ghetto, we have a situation what's called hyper-segregation. You go to any black area of Chicago and you look around, what you're going to find is that in these areas, you're going to find no less than 92% blacks living in those areas. Okay? But if you go to an ethnic neighborhood in Chicago, you will rarely find that that ethnic group is more than a majority in that neighborhood. It's called hyper-segregation. Okay, so we just talked about all that. So when you get to the 40s and the 60s, right, you get the first Mayor Daley, who began to say, okay, one way to stop the ghetto from growing spatially out is to grow it up. Robert Taylor Holmes, right? Okay, right? Hyper-segregation, then came redlining. Let me quickly talk about this and then I want to move on. Redlining is critical because it's still happening. But it didn't begin with real estate agents. Redlining was begun as a program of the Federal Home Owners Association program under the New Deal in 1933. They had criteria for making low-cost loans to first-time home buyers. So I'll give you the criteria, you decode the language for me. So, number one, new, highly desirable, homogeneous. Those areas are number one for getting these loans. So, new area, what do you think that means? Huh? Well, ultimately it would be the suburbs, but a new area, right? New construction, right? Okay. Highly desirable. Well, let's not jump the gun.
Non-ghetto.
Let's not jump the gun. Highly desirable. Low prices, or it's new. So, right, you know, when people build the new development, people want to go, you know, they want to live in the new houses, right? Homogeneous. Now, do you think that means that every house looks the same? Even every third house. Is that what they meant by homogeneous? What do you think they meant by homogeneous? The people. Homogeneous. Number two for loans. Developed. Still highly desirable. Homogeneous. What do you think that means? Decode that for me. Developed.
Existing area.
It's already an existing built-up area, but it's still highly desirable. Right? You know, Naperville, whatever. Right? And it's still highly desirable. What's the connection? Highly desirable, homogeneous. Right? That's the connection. Right? Because number three was developed some undesirable, heterogeneous, or less desirable. So it's a developed area, not very desirable, and it's heterogeneous, meaning heterogeneous. Who's living there? Huh? It's a mixed group, right? So that's number three for getting a loan. Number four, developed, not desirable, homogeneous. So it's developed language. No loans in those areas, right? So it makes it, it reinforces the idea of pitting people into a certain area. And then, of course, again, I'll refer to Massey and Denton on this. If you look at the spatial history of Chicago and the development of the suburbs, once an area got to be over 10% black, white flight was triggered. Right? Okay. This is 1940, 1950, 1960. I'll run through that again for you. 1940, 50, 60. What's happening here? The ghetto's expanding, but it's not everywhere. You don't see a lot of black dots all over the map. They're in very specific locations, right? Now, through the 40s and 50s, blacks were able to join unions during the New Deal. A. Philip Randolph becomes the first vice president of the AFL-CIO. Manufacturing is just going crazy because the world's just been basically destroyed, Europe and Japan, and we're rebuilding it with the Marshall Plan. Labor is plentiful, and so African Americans are working in factories, and I mean, obviously there's still, a high unemployment rate. I mean, traditionally double the national unemployment rate. Yet, for people like my parents, this was the time where there was the first opening towards reaching the middle class. Right? My dad went to college. Right? He was the first one in his family to do that. My wife's father worked in a steel foundry in Davenport, Iowa. Right? Made good money. Was the first one in his family to own his own home. Right? I mean, along with, we don't have time to get into all of the legalities going on, but of course you have Brown v. Board, and you have some level of integration in some areas, and you have some greater ability at home ownership. But then the 70s came, right? Compact cars come in. Detroit's not doing so good. Some of us who are old enough remember when Chrysler went belly up, the first auto bailout, right? Which gave us the minivan. Well, I don't know what you think about that, but anyway. Then the 1980s, we began offshoring jobs. And what kind of jobs were the first ones to go? Manufacturing. So what happens to the surplus labor pool that you've been exploiting for industrial labor when the economy shifts from manufacturing to service? And from service to technology? When you have systematically kept out resources like good public schools, banking, financial resources, right? I mean, yes, the Community Reinvestment Act of 1988 was signed, was never enforced. So what do you have? You have resources out, you have excess labor in, with no apparent manufacturing base to absorb that labor, in areas that are already hyper-segregated. We still live in a capitalist system. People need money. What begins to grow? The underground economy. Now, I don't have time to go into all of this. Sometime when, look, all of you just go to Benedictine, take my class, and then I can give you all of it. But here's the issue. Heroin in the 60s, cocaine in the 70s, crack in the 80s and 90s. I don't think they grow coca on the south side. Just don't manufacture AR-15s and Uzis in Morgan Park. I don't think that happens. But somehow, in initiated by Nixon and then really ramped up by Reagan and then finally institutionalized by Clinton, drugs are rampant in the black community. So that gives rise to larger police forces who police in those areas. At the same time, end of the Cold War comes. You've got Westinghouse and all of these companies who are developing technology for military benefit, but now, who knows, we might actually have a peace dividend. So, for example, when you watch these soldiers, they got those night vision goggles come down over their helmet. You know what I'm talking about? Right? Those were first developed for prisons, not for combat. Right? That's where that technology was. So now, with a war on drugs, we've got to prosecute the war. And how did we prosecute the war? Okay, let me put it another way. Did we prosecute the war by stopping drugs from getting into the United States? Certainly you've got the famous San Jose Mercury piece that shows that the DEA was at least complicit in some operations in letting drugs into the country. We fought the war on drugs on the end user, right? We're picking up the guy who's buying a couple of rocks on the corner. That's who we're putting in jail. 86% of those who are in prison right now are nonviolent drug offenders. That's the war on drugs. And it creates a new profit center. Prisons. Who become this mixture of public-private money to develop prisons which are incredibly profitable. Right? So you have rural communities who want stable employment opportunities, so they want prisons. You have states who can get investment from private firms along with public dollars to build the prisons. Then you staff them with locals. The profit's guaranteed. Then you can bring in all the other tangential things, your Sodexo, for example, for all your food and so on. You can begin manufacturing things in the prison. It's not just for making license plates anymore. The first, some of you are in here will remember this, TWA? Yeah. Okay, few of us remember TWA. Okay, it was an airline, okay? They were the first company to open a remote call center. So when you called the 1-800 number, you were connected to one of their operators. They weren't at the airport. They were in the prison. Right? There are 30% of the flak jackets that our soldiers wear in combat are produced in prison. There was a major jean company started at the Oregon State Prison, right? Levi's had to sue the state of Oregon to stop the manufacture and sale of this brand called Prison Blues because they were making blue jeans with prison labor, selling it on the market. Right, they had this whole commercial thing about how cool it was to be a prisoner and all, whatever. And they were selling these jeans and the profit was going right back to the state. There are technology companies who were in business one day, bankrupt, reopening in prisons. Every stick of furniture in the Department of Defense, prison labor. Now there's some great benefits to that. I mean, from an employer perspective, no union, 22 cents an hour, no food, no strikes, nobody's going anywhere, it's a stable labor force, right? If you're AT&T, you can make tons of money on overcharging for those collect calls. I mean, it's a huge business. We're talking about a $10–20 billion industry here. This is big money. What is the raw material of a prison? Prisoners. Prisoners. So, 3 strikes and you're out. Right? Mandatory sentencing. Mandatory minimums. 5 grams of crack, 5 years in prison. Right? That only went down just a couple years ago. I'm going to come to questions in 1 second. Okay, great. Because I'm almost finished. Because I want to get to my punchline. Okay, so here's the jump in the prison population. From 300,000 in 72, 2.3 million today. Here's Illinois. African Americans, 2,128 per 100,000 in prison. Just go to the Cook County Jail and just stand there. Watch the buses leave. Look inside the buses and tell me what you see. First year unemployment, 60% when you get out. 3-year recidivism rates, 67% of offenders are rearrested, 51% are reincarcerated. This is where the real money is. Because what have we given people when they get out of prison? This is what Michelle doesn't deal with enough. We give them social death. In some states, even if you've served your time, you can't vote. When you check, I have been convicted of a crime, employers can legally discriminate against you and say, you don't get the job. Same thing for housing. So how do you expect someone who's been in prison, who wants to get their life together, but they can't get a job, they can't get housing? States like Illinois have cut transitional programs. What are you going to do? I mean, we still live in, right? This is capitalism, right? I still need some money. Okay, whatever. I don't have time to deal with schools. But this is the end game right here. Okay? The greatest threat to the United States is not terrorism. It's nihilism. Because this is what's developed through the prison industrial complex and is spread. What is nihilism? It's a rejection of established authority. It's people who don't believe that the government or any other institution is really working on their behalf. It's a rejection in the belief of established institutions. This is the first explosion of nihilism, in my opinion, on the American scene. This is Los Angeles in 1992. All right, the Rodney King riots. Right? And why were people rioting? Because they didn't have opportunity. They didn't have hope. They had what Cornel West calls a profound sense of aloneness, of hopelessness. And if I've lost hope, why would I believe that your institution, whatever it is going to help me? Let's go back to Chicago. Here's what I hear. Well, let's not talk about police officers murdering people. Let's talk about black people killing black people. Okay, let's talk about it. Here's the residential pattern. Dark red is hyper-segregated black areas. Hasn't changed from the other maps I showed you, has it? Nope. Lack of resources, lack of capital, terrible schools, etc., etc. Here's where all the murders are. I mean, come on. You cannot say with a straight face that these things are not connected and are not connected to a wider system of colonial oppression. It's right here. Or it's in Detroit. Or Flint. Do you think Flint could happen in Barrington? You think Flint could happen down here in, what's that town that services South Elgin? Bartlett? Is that Bartlett?
St. Charles.
Wherever it is. You think that could happen in the District 204 in Naperville? No. But if you go and you can go look at several photo essays, and you look at the Detroit schools with mold growing on the walls, no heat, no air, windows broken out, and expecting teachers to teach and students to learn in that environment. Crazy. It's a lack of hope. And these two guys are running for president. Now, let me tell you about this threat. Because the nihilistic threat has jumped, right? As long as nihilism was inside the black community, nobody really cared, right? You know, nothing we can really do. But it has since, in the last 25 years, the nihilism has jumped out of black America, and it is more diffused. Why is Donald Trump leading in the polls? Who is he appealing to? White, middle-class men who are afraid for their jobs, see their lives turning upside down, see a demographic shift that may take away their power, and they're scared. And they want somebody, anybody, to stop the fear. You know, we want our country back. Okay. That's nihilism. And on the other flip side of the coin is Bernie Sanders. Those who are living paycheck to paycheck, who want to hold out some hope that maybe the government can work for us, but we're not really convinced. Maybe we need a revolution. That's the word that's getting young people excited about Bernie Sanders. Right? It's not tax policy or universal health care. It's the word revolution. Because they are in a state of hopelessness. When I graduate with over $100,000 in debt, or the average, sorry, I'll go with the average numbers, is $37,000 in debt. Hopelessness, aloneness. Those of you who are addicted to Facebook, I would argue you are in the shadow of the nihilistic threat, where we believe real community only exists in a virtual world. I have 872 verses. Really? But we think that that's true. Nihilism. That's the threat. That's the threat. And the prison industrial complex is one manifestation of this growing threat to our country. Because the more you listen to, whether it's Springfield or Washington or on the campaign trail, The language you hear is the language of fear, of hate, of hopelessness. And that is the nihilistic threat. Okay, thank you. Not as much time left as I want, but we got a few minutes for questions, so we'll start back here. Hold on, I gotta get back here so I can hear
Stand
what
and speak louder, please. Thank you.
Right. 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 Yes, and that is a large part of the, now CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, is the largest private prison builder, staffer in the country. Absolutely right. But the prisons they build are still public-private partnerships, right? Your tax money is what gives them their profit, right? And they have other investors, American Express, Chase, Merrill Lynch, Prudential. I mean, so they have a lot of investors. By the way, how does a corporation based on building prisons, how do you think they make their projections for how much prison space they're going to need?
Third grade outcomes.
Bang! They look at third grade reading ISAT tests because they know that third graders who significantly read below grade level are more likely to drop out of school and therefore more likely to end up in prison. Okay? Not to mention high stakes, the whole issue of high stakes testing, zero tolerance, and so on, which puts kids on the straight path to being overly suspended and eventually expelled from school. And when kids get expelled from school, they're more likely to end up in prison. Absolutely right. Thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. Woo! Maybe one or two more.
We have a few more minutes, so.
Okay. Anybody? It was that good? I'm getting better with age.
Solutions.
Ah, thank you. What can we do about it? Now that was me asking you. What do we do about it? Man, come on, y'all gonna have to fix it. So, let's go.
Put a program for ex-felons to come out and...
Okay, more programs for ex-felons, which is absolutely, I believe, an urgent priority. The problem is twofold. On the national level, there's not a lot of urgency to spend dollars on ex-cons, right? Secondly, a lot of local governments don't want to create transitional housing units for people transitioning from prison because those units are in residential communities. So they don't want to help. They don't want to do that. You know, we looked at Aurora trying to get one, and it would have been perfect in an old motel. Nobody was using it. You know, the city could have sold it to a group of us. You know, cheap rehab it. You know, bring in all kinds of city services, or nurse care, education, job training, all that stuff in a motel literally designed perfectly for what we wanted to do, and the city wouldn't budge because there were aldermen who didn't want to support a program, a residential program, to transition felons. So yeah, it's a big need, and there needs to be a push from from activists everywhere to have local governments approve those kinds of projects. In fact, Chief Powell is part of that effort. Great point. What else can we do?
Have more programs in like the school system, starting early, elementary school, middle school, high school.
Yeah,
Start
sure.
early.
If CCA is looking at third grade test scores, what's the best way to raise those test scores? Mandatory early childhood education. Preschool for every child. How about putting heat and air in the schools? I don't know. Might make sense. Maybe the way we fund education is an issue to look at. I don't think that poor school districts and poor performing school districts, especially in Illinois, is a function of residential segregation. Right? You know, New Trier is certainly spending more money than Elgin Central. Right? Or East Aurora. Or East St. Louis. Right? So certainly those are long-term solutions. We've got to fix education. Because kids who can read, who graduate from high school, are less likely to go to prison. Okay? Keeping fathers in the home. Right? Fathers who are in the home, their children are less likely to go to prison. Which raises a whole host of tax and other policy issues. Okay, all right. We can do one more.
Yeah, we're okay.
Give me one more solution, then we'll leave.
Rehabilitation for those that are incarcerated under
Let me deal with that for 1 second, then we'll close. One of the issues that we see, and a couple of friends of Christine Rivers is writing on this right now at DePaul, is what happens inside the prison, and as well as what happens afterwards. Because when we started the big prison construction phase in the early 90s, what went out of the prison was the reform-minded tradition. So prisons became a place of punishment, not a place of rehabilitation. So educational programming and so on was out, more solitary confinement, work in the sense of working on whatever that prison may have been doing for whatever company, but no psychological intervention, no kind of AA, NA, those kind of programs, right? Get your GED or your college diploma while you're in prison, right? Those programs, they went away, right? And punishment is the norm. So when you come out, you're not any more, in a sense, credentialed or qualified to do anything than before you went in.
In fact, your way wears off.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
it makes the process even worse. I have brothers that has been to prison, and it made them worse mentally. Messed them up. So
Say that again?
actually, the rehabilitation program really kind of not working because I have brothers that has been to prison and they came out worse.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Well, if you read Foucault on prisons, right? He argues that the purpose of what has happened in the modern prison system is we have gone from punishing the body to punishing the soul. Right?